In the earlier session, we learned about specialized variants of predicate, consumer, and supplier for handling Java primitive types. In this session, we will continue on what we have learned so far and look at specializations of the function. The three types of functions that exist for primitives are int function, double function, and long function, but there's one notable change. Remember, function takes in an argument and returns a result. The declaration of the function goes like this. The input to the function is an integer, while the output is your employee. We are specifying both input and output types here. When it comes to working primitive functions, the expectation is that primitives are the inputs implicitly. So if we convert the same employee function using an integer primitive function, it becomes like this. As you can see, the integer type has been dropped in favor of the name of the function itself. So here, the expectation is that the integer is already implicitly passed in as the input argument. So all we have to do is declare the output argument for this function. You read this function as given an integer as the input, return an employee as the output. So the same rule follows for the double as well as long functions. So given primitive double as your input, return the employee. Given a long primitive to the function, return an employee as the output. What about a function consuming in a double and returning an integer? In this case, both double and integer are both primitives. So we have two ways of doing this. Let's see the first way. This function uses two reference types rather than primitives. This is second function incarnation, which is a slight improvement. This function takes in double as the primitive double as your input and returns the integer, but the integer is still a reference type. So we need an input as a small double, that is a primitive double, and output as primitive int. The third variation of the function deals only with primitives. Given a primitive double, it returns a primitive integer. There is another function created in the library for this particular purpose. As you can see, this double and this int becomes your input and output arguments. This function is used to create a transformation of double to a primitive int. The generics of types is vanished away, and as the name suggests, the input will be primitive double while the output will be primitive int. The method name declared in the functional interface isn't the apply method though, it's the apply as int. Similar to this function, there are a handful of primitive to primitive conversion functions as well. So let's write them down here with function name as well as the method names defined in these interfaces. Let's wrap up here. In this session, we have learned the variants of the single argument functions for primitive values. Once we know the workings of one of them, it's not hard to crack the others.